Okay, I'm going to assume that we've started. I'm going to assume that the live stream has started. Welcome, everybody, to the Color of Law, the third session. It looks like we might be going solo today, which is okay. It's not bad. I hope everyone is still enthused if you're listening on another day to to go through the chapters. So these chapters today are going to be chapters 6 through 8. So we're going through 3. And that means that next week will be the final session of this book, and um, we will conclude there and move on to something else, something new. And I'm looking forward to both getting the final analysis review on this book and uh, and moving on to great new futures. Um, so I think what we'll do for today is just go over the new chapters really quick instead of like summarizing what we've already gone through, the chapters 1 through 5, and then um, and then go through our updated timeline, the brief history of civil rights, which I have updated and should be a little more detailed and have more fun new things to look at. Um, so chapter 6 is white flight, and it is quite short and actually doesn't mention white flight quite very much at all, from what I noticed. Doesn't mention the term. It kind of talks about things related to white flight, but doesn't really. It doesn't really mention anything. It doesn't like describe what white flight was. The debates that are going around it. So I was a little bit underwhelmed. Let's say we could say by that. But it's continuing with like what we learned before about the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, um, and it's kind of describing how uh, integrated neighbor they would promote the idea that integrated neighborhoods would lose financial value and use this basically to get banks to deny conventional mortgages to black families. And then it also describes something blockbusting, this tactic of blockbusting that real estate agents or would use to actually induce like 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 scam and trick white families into selling their houses for a lower rate that the real estate agents would buy and then resell to a black family, like making a huge profit. It's kind of a really interesting or really despicable, but it's a really interesting considering what he went through with blockbusting before. Just for a reminder, blockbusting is the practice of white families when they heard that that black families or were interested or maybe starting to move into a neighborhood, would, for fear of their own houses losing value, convince all of the other white families in the neighborhood to sell their houses. And now we're seeing that this panic was actually induced by we could say uh, people looking to make a quick buck to to cause blockbusting and to cause white flight, which is really interesting to me. Chapter 7 describes a little bit about the IRS, how the IRS, with their tax exempt status to particular organizations, how that was used and levied to to give tax exemptions to organizations, universities, communities that theoretically shouldn't have, because if you're a discriminatory organization, you theoretically shouldn't get a tax exemption um, because it's constitutionally tax exemptions are for at after a certain time, after the Supreme Court had described tax exemption, or sorry, described that non-discrimination was a right or something that should be enforced. That they shouldn't be, these organizations shouldn't be tax exempt, but in many cases they did remain that way. So yeah, there's that, and then there's the idea of equal access to credits that goes through in the context of the 2008 financial crisis and the anti-redlining stuff. And then I'll go through that in a little more detail in a second here. And then chapter 8 is very much about the ways that local municipalities, the tactics that they would use to enforce and to enforce discrimination and to actually decimate poor and black communities, pretty much. One of these has to do with the construction of federal highways, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. Um, so hold on. So let's start with chapter 6, just the few notes I have here. Um, White flight. As I said, didn't doesn't really mention too much about white flight. It's more about quite a short chapter that's describing these blockbusting practices and a little bit more about the FHA. But one thing I found interesting was so the blockbusting tactics that were described here with the let's get a bit more specific about who these people were first though. So these were real estate developers, right? Speculators. Okay, you saw the blockbuster scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above market prices, persuaded white families that residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that the values would soon fall precipitously. Then purchased the panic white homes for far less than they're worth. Okay, so that's just describing the method, and they're described as speculators, and this is an example in East Palo Alto specifically. So and so I guess some of the tactics that these speculators would perform or would use would include like hiring like African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios and blasting through white neighborhoods. Oh, that would work. Uh, Paying African American men to accompany agents knocking on doors to see if homes were for sale, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking them to speak with someone with like a stereotypically African American name like Johnny May. I've never heard that name before. I would be confused. I guess that was maybe in the past was more popular. They would also take out real estate advertisements in African American newspapers, and even if the featured properties were not for sale, and the purpose was to attract potential African American buyers to walk around the white areas that were targeted for blockbusting. 19 Post article. An agent using the pseudonym Norris Vitchek claimed to have arranged house burglaries in white communities to scare neighbors into believing that their communities were becoming unsafe. Okay, so yeah, basically, I thought that was interesting because um, this is something that we could. This is why I was expecting a little bit more um, from this chapter on the discussion of white flight because there is a big kind of confusion, I would say, about white flight and what it is, and this is kind of one of the central themes of the book in general. One of the central parts of the thesis, we could say, even when he's talking about de jure versus de facto segregation. White flight is a really big piece of the puzzle, I would say, because of what people's perceptions of it are. So, like, if we just go to a quick Wikipedia article, um, I think most people understand it to be the migration of middle class white populations in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even mainly northeastern cities like Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, um, but also just everywhere. It includes the Midwest, Kansas City, Chicago, and even Oakland, California. Um, Although racial segregations of public schools entered their level before the Supreme Court of the U.S.'s decisions in Brown v. Board in 1954. In the 1970s, attempts to achieve effective desegregation or integration by means of busing some areas led to more families moving out of former areas. More generally, some historians suggest that white flight occurred in response to population pressures, both from the large migrations of blacks from the rural southern U.S. or urban cities of the northeastern U.S., um, the Midwest and the Western U.S. During the Great Migration and the waves of new immigrants from around the world. So yeah, this is just a piece from Wikipedia, and it's talking much more about like population pressures and things that would give much more of like a local agency and kind of maybe even a non-racist reason for white flight, right? But this is one of the things that the author is challenging, like one of the central tendencies challenging. So that's why I'm just saying I was a little bit maybe underwhelmed by the chapter on white flight. I was expecting a little bit more, um, and more generally the way he kind of moves around the timeline. I feel he kind of loses the narrative momentum because he does start from an early, the 1883 Supreme Court decision, and he kind of has this narrative momentum going through the early 20th century, and then we focus a lot on the New Deal, and then we seem to be going to the 1950s, and then he kind of moves around a little too much. And I get that you don't when you're making a historical narrative, you're not always it's not always going to be clean like that. You might want to jump around from time to time, but if you do too much, oh hey Q, no, oh no, oh sorry, I just realized I was muted. I've been I've been talking a little bit, and we are actually I'm just recording. So actually, my mic has been active on YouTube, but actually it hasn't been active on Discord. Sorry. I did not realize I was muted. Uh, so yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just going through the chapter on white flight now, and I'll just uh I'll just kind of reiterate some of the points I was making. So I thought this was he goes through blockbusting tactics in this chapter, and some FHA, the Federal Housing Administration uh practices, but I feel that he did not like address the mainstream which call it perceptions of what white flight is. So I was just like reading this little blurb from Wikipedia that's making it seem like it was more due to population pressures, these kind of people, like kind of like really non-racialized um, explanations for white flight. And I was just saying that I think like he did do some interesting things. It's in this chapter. It's a very short chapter, and uh, it's not really covering what I would hoped he would have. He didn't even I think mention white flight, like the term white flight, throughout the chapter. So I was like a little bit confused there. And he does jump around the historical his history a little bit too much. He goes. I felt there was like a big narrative momentum from where he's starting in post Civil War um, to the 1883 Supreme Court decision revoking housing policy, and then going to the early 20th century, then moving on from there to the Great War, Great Migration, to the New Deal, and last week we were like in the 1950s or about era, and now he's kind of like moving around a lot. So Yeah, I was just saying I was a bit underwhelmed with that chapter. Uh, but I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying, just giving a little critique there. Um, the IRS support and compliant regulators. And just so you're aware, we're going through. I'm just going through chapters 6 through 8, and then we're going to finish off next week. Yeah, I thought about rescheduling. The reason I didn't do it is because it's best for me to talk about these stuff like the closer to the point that I've read it. Like if I'm going to talk about it next week, I'll have notes and stuff, but it won't be as clear in my mind. So I'm going to record the YouTube for everybody, and then if people watch it, we can continue on next week to with what we're doing. Um, okay, this is an IRS support. He's talking about. I'm not sure if you remember this, but he does mention the ways in which the IRS uses tax exemption kind of in an unconstitutional way post 1948, that decision. So in 1948 there was this Shelley versus Kramer decision that kind of revoked the idea that it's a major part of housing discrimination, we could say, and it kind of reinvigorates the 14th Amendment, saying no, like you can't, like especially for like federal agencies, you can't say that, for example, that housing is a private contract or deal between two people, and that allows for discrimination. That, as a matter of fact, um, when it comes to civil rights, African Americans have an extra layer of they have an extra layer of what you call it of oh, what's the word I'm looking for here? They have an extra layer of I forget the word. I can't think of the word I was going to use, but they have an extra protection, we could say, um, and that their right to housing, like, is you have to positively, they have positive rights instead of in this arena. You can't, like, even as a private person, practice in discrimination. Um, so okay, when tax exempt colleges and universities, there are many colleges and universities that practiced that were like very that were all white, or we could say, and they were tax exempt up until often throughout the 60s and 70s, and it wasn't until this time that until much later that, even though it was constitutionally not right that they would get tax exemptions, they kept their tax exemptions for far after that. Then he also goes here he jumps forward quite a bit to the 2008 crisis as well. So this is where I'm also like, okay, we're jumping around quite a bit, which is fine. I mean, it's very relevant, but yeah. So I don't know how, if you remember this, Hugh, but obviously there's a housing crisis of 2008. But in the early 2000s, actually a lot of the subprime mortgage crisis that we are all familiar with was actually also very racialized. The reverse redlining was a big um, idea behind this too. So it's just describing the idea that there's an excessive marketing of these exploitative loans, these subprime loans into African American communities. So that, and I think his point here is that yes, it was largely felt, but they were particularly felt in Black communities because they bore a disproportionate brunt of the subprime mortgage crisis. Uh, oop, what happened there? Here, I'll see if you're still there. I know you got to leave soon, so I'll just keep going if you're still around. So he talks about yield spread premiums. These are just the idea that you receive if you're a broker, you can receive bonuses from making these very predatory loans. It's pretty bad. Um, um, Several cities sued banks because of enormous devastations and that foreclosure crisis imposed on African American. Yep. Another thing he does, which I'm not, we could call this a critique, but he does provide a lot of examples, which is fine and good, but it does like make it hard to keep the coherent narrative in mind between chapters. Like I get that this chapter, for example, is about he's going into the IRS and regulators and connecting that to the 2008 housing crisis, but I'm struggling at times um to get the overall point of the chapter or get the main message of the chapters. And I think it's particularly with these three. Like I was like, okay, I was struggling a little bit to like make a coherent like this. Okay, this is what we're talking about, and then find the examples, the most relevant examples I thought that he gave, and kind of like make a really coherent point there. Um, that's just something I'm not sure if anyone you spoke with had the same issue, but I think it was worse in these three than previously. Um, for me personally. So in chapter 8, he talks about local tactics. Local tactics for enforcing segregation, and this is going through some pretty interesting stuff, I thought. So he describes this organization called the American Friends Service Committee, the AFSC. It's a Quaker group that was committed to racial integration. Um, and they were involved in like kind of promoting this Sunny Hills project in Milpitas, and this is in California, I believe. This was a huge public works project for like veterans, involving veterans, and basically for auto workers. Basically, a lot of Ford auto workers would be living here, and it was near the Ford auto plant. So in the end, the auto workers, the union, where the UAW were voted to like make it into an integrated neighborhood. So this was good and kind of not exactly. Doesn't sound like it was a normal decision for the time. This was 1955, so that's good. But um, and on top of this, the UAW in this area, I suppose their membership was overwhelmingly white. So that you would think that, given like the examples and the history, sorry, that we've heard, that they wouldn't vote this way, but for some reason they did. They voted for an integrated neighborhood. But obviously that there's going to be people who don't like this decision. As there seem to be everywhere. So in this case, it was David Bonen's company. There's I guess Metropolitan Life is one of them. Just various people who were involved in development of the region. My guess is also that the FHA probably wouldn't like that as well. Even though at this time they're legally they can't do anything about it because of the 1948 decision. But they held an emergency meeting with the sanitary district to adopt an ordinance to increase the sewer connection fee by more than 10 times what it was, which was around $100 before, and pretty much just caused like the suspension of the work. So this was no longer being developed, and long term, it was just this project was just abandoned. So yeah, he's just describing like this is a really big example he gave about some of the ways that integrated communities and neighborhoods were prevented from from coming about. And this is pretty common. Even so, even if you have like the local population would vote to like say, hey, we want an integrated neighborhood. There's usually like somebody in the pipework, whether it be the mayor, whether it be people who are doing the in charge in control of development, they'll stop it somehow, which is very sad. Okay, I forget what this one was about. Um, but the other one I thought was really interesting was had to do with the highways. I'm not sure if you remember this part too, but in 1956, the Federal Highway Act was passed by Eisenhower, and it was big project. It's like the equivalent of 220 billion in today's dollars with 41,000 miles. Um, and funnily enough, like I always did think this myself. It was like said to be for the purpose of national defense. You know, if a nuclear bomb, if the Soviets nuke us, and we need to evacuate people, or there's an invasion, you know, the highways are like, you know, they're a necessary infrastructure to have for people to evacuate cities quickly and efficiently, so that you know. I remember hearing this growing up too, but there's apparently like some people who, looking back now, like this actually wasn't something that was mentioned by Eisenhower. Like, this was much more of a transportation and economically um, focused idea that Eisenhower focused on. So this was also a slum clearance tool. Basically, is what it became. One of the uses it had. Um, let's go back down here. Hold on. So so basically, slums and blight were some of the terms used to describe African American neighborhoods. And so when 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 they would propose like these highway projects, you know, you need, in order to for them to reach the central city, they're going to be destroying some neighborhood. And whose neighborhoods are they going to be destroying? It's like, well, people who have no economic or political power, people who on very often uh, black neighborhoods are going to be going. So pretty much this was the idea that uh, from 1956 onwards, we saw more and more, like basically that the government would, I guess, purchase or confiscate these houses in some cases, and then just destroy them, and with no plan about what to do with the people that had previously lived there. There's no like, oh, okay, we're going to give you you know, the time to relocate, even some in some instances, or we're gonna, you know, we're gonna provide you with relocation somewhere. It's just pretty much just destroying the neighborhoods and without doing anything in return. um you're good. Okay, cool. um and this, so if we remember, the Highway Act was in 1956. um it was not until like 1965 that the federal government finally stepped in and decided to do something about this, and saying like, okay, well, now you need to like provide active relocation for those who are like whose homes are being destroyed, who are being forced out of their houses. But you know, by this time it's kind of too late, because the highways are already kind of complete. They're nearly complete, at least. So yeah, too late. And I'm pretty sure that nothing was done to repay those families who had lost their homes and stuff like that. And I think we have pictures of that too. Yeah, this is a house, a wrecking ball being taken to a house. I think this is in Camden, New Jersey, if I remember. Yep. Uh, pretty sad. Yeah. So here's this is from the Camden, New Jersey example. Here is it's about 3,000 low-income housing units were destroyed from 63 to 67. And the report from the New Jersey State Attorney General's office concluded that it's obvious from a glance that the transit plans is an attempt that's being made to eliminate the Black and Puerto Rican ghetto areas by building highways that benefit white suburbanites, facilitating their movement from suburbs to work and back. Obviously, yeah, this is where it is throughout the book. It's not okay these days, but this is something that everyone was apparently using all the time. Um, so yeah, and then there's also the post Brown v. Board tactic. So after the 1954 Brown v. Board decision, another local tactic that was employed to um, prevent integration. And yeah, a lot of this book is about a law is passed saying, hey, you can't do this, and really behind the scenes something is done to basically negate the text of the law and re- retain the de facto order of things. If that makes sense to you. Authorities developed another. Okay, so in the case in the case of Brown v. Board, placing the only schools that served African American children in designated African American neighborhoods and providing no transportation for Black students who lived elsewhere. African American families who wanted their children to be educated had no chance but to find new housing in the newly segregated areas. So it pretty much exactly what I said. It's just okay. So if you're still here, still around, I'll go through. I said I would do this at the beginning. Just really quick, the brief history of civil rights, the timeline that I made. If you might find this interesting. So, 1865 is the 13th Amendment. Basically, its point is that you can't replicate the conditions of slavery, even if you're getting so basically, even if your slavery is now outlawed, like the conditions of slavery like matter too. Just because you're not calling it slavery doesn't mean it's not slavery, right? Or it doesn't replicate certain conditions of it. Um, and this is, I think, codified in the 1866 Civil Rights Act. Um, and then 2 years later, the 14th Amendment. This is the first time where equality is mentioned between people in general, not just not just like landowners or whatever. I'm not going to have the most succinct and great way of describing like legal and constitutional things because I'm obviously law is not my foundation of education, but so I'm not going to be like the most elegantly spoken person when it comes to this stuff, but I'll do my best. Do my best. So in '76, the fraudulent elections and suppression of African American votes. So okay, yeah, and basically this is describing throughout the South. There were basically like really funky elections that took place where fraudulent ballots were cast. The total vote exceeded the entire voting age population. Blah blah. And this is just saying that basically that to prevent kind of like some of the things that the Reconstruction was trying to change to reconstruct, we could say. There were resistance movements that actually manipulated elections. Um, and 1 year later is the end of Reconstruction. So it only took about a decade and didn't really accomplish very much, as we've said before. Um, and then here's what I mentioned earlier in was the 1883 Supreme Court decision. This pretty much negated the 13th and 14th Amendments when it came to housing, pretty much. So for the next, however, like century or so, I think this is the main point of the book. Like segregation or characteristics of slavery as it pertains to housing were allowed to continue and and become even worse. Then we have the first Great Migration taking place in 1910 to 1940. This is in large result um, due to new economic opportunities that come with the First World War, and so you have a lot of new jobs being up north, which is a great industrial base, right? And so there's new opportunities for people. So you have new migrants. Makes sense, right? You also have lots of European migrants coming at the same time. Um, but migration's always a really tricky one to describe sometimes because kind of like crime, there's multiple factors going into it. So there are economic opportunities. Some people also I've heard say that for some reason, like in the South, Black people were trying to escape Jim Crow conditions and all that stuff, and that might have contributed too. I don't know. Do you know? Have you heard of any of these things before? I'll leave you time to if you have anything to say. Um, so 1917, freedom of contract. Okay, yeah. So this is describing there's a Supreme Court decision that kind of negates a large part, a big piece of civil rights by saying that it's kind of like a freedom of association or freedom of blah blah blah. Like and that actually negates a lot of non-discrimination in practice because if you have freedom of association or freedom of contract, whatever you want to call it, um, you can do things like what is that thing called? I forget what it's called. Well, you can you can make contracts essentially that say you can't resell your house to a non-white person, and which actually happened. We're going to come across the term, I'm sure, later, but um, and the this is around the time also that zoning stuff begins, and Herbert Hoover, the future president, is involved in a lot of this. So he's zoning ordinances. So why some places in a city should be just purely residential, like not mixed zoning, like we have it still exists largely in Europe today. Like we don't have like just purely residential suburban areas. Uh, we do, but they're less common, I would say. Um, but in this case, the motivation seems largely racial, at least from the accounting that we've gotten from here. And it makes sense too, because with zoning, you're able to skirt a lot of the technicalities of the law as well. Um, okay, so I think this becomes an official Supreme Court, yeah, ruling in 1926. So Justice George Sutherland explained that very often the apartment house is a mere parasite constructed in order to take advantage of the open spaces and attractive surrounding created by residential character of the district, and that the apartment houses in single family districts come very near to being nuisances. Okay. So, yeah, you could say, oh, this is purely classist, but of course, it's disproportionately affecting. It's going to be used as an excuse to keep Black people out of neighborhoods, pretty much. This, along with like things like freedom of contract. Um, and this is why I also think that that we should look at classism also like very much as part of the problem, because if this is an okay thing to say from a public policy perspective, same thing as like the idea that it's not about race, it's about we want to protect our property values, and that poor these undesirable people moving into our neighborhood are going to affect our property values. I don't even think that's a valid complaint. It kind of is if our entire wealth and everything we own is tied to our property, but see that's part of the systemic issue then. Um And I do think people get duped by that into like making racist decisions as well, alongside just being racist. I don't know if that makes sense to you, or if I'm, yeah, cool. All right. Herbert Hoover's in 28. Then we know the Great Depression comes. And you weren't here last week for this, but we went over a big Federal Housing Administration discussion, which was created by FDR during the new as a part of the New Deal. It's a new agency, and it's heavily biased um, by these homeowners administrations who are very anti. Um, they're very anti mixed neighborhoods, or and they're for the prevention of mixed neighbor, the prevention of integrated neighborhoods. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. And basically, throughout their tenure up until 1948, they're actively denying fund loans. They're denying, yeah, they're denying the ability to create housing to any neighborhood that might be mixed, or just outright just neighborhoods that are African American, because they are quote unquote a risky investment. So that's another thing we went through last week, was how these very clinical language that we often use in economics, like risky investments, and it's just a bit purely business decision, blah blah blah. How this is used, kind of, to mask the real intention behind what you really mean. And yeah, I thought this was the greatest example of that. The FHA, they're really terrible, terrible organization. Um, the Second Great Migration happens in from period of 1940 to 1970, and this is again a wartime period. So I guess what separates the two periods, the two migrations, is Great Depression. So that's to say, like, there was a continual move. If we're talking just about black populations, there was a continual move northwards that was just interrupted by the Great Depression. But they're split into two migrations. That's my idea, at least. I don't know. And here's a new thing I added here. So it actually, in 1948, there's a report published by an FHA official that actually that property values aren't decreased by black families moving into white neighborhoods. That's actually, they tend to increase because the richest, not the richest, the more wealthy black families are the ones that are usually able to afford those houses. So they're actually usually more wealthy than the poorest members of the neighborhood. So they actually, if anything, they'll increase the property values. But again, this is not a good um, this is not a good reason. I feel the fact that we're focused on property values to begin with, take personal issue with. I don't think that's, even if this was true, right? My personal feeling doesn't matter. You shouldn't discriminate against people. You shouldn't discriminate against poor people. You shouldn't discriminate people for a racial reason. For any reason, right? This whole systemically, I think, is really bad for me. Um, Shelley, okay, and then this is the decision we went over, the Shelley v. Kramer decision. This is pretty much the housing equivalent to the Brown v. Board of Education. This is finally overruling um, this idea that you can have something like, okay, here we go. It's a covenant. It's a restrictive covenant. This is the idea that you can have something like this, which is an actual example of a contract where it describes, here, there's in the contract that the property shall never be occupied, used, or resided in by any person not of the white or Caucasian race, except by the capacity of servant or domestic employee. So this is in the contract, and this is called a racial covenant. And this is how people kind of technically got around the fact that theoretically by law you're not supposed to be able to do this, but if it's a private agreement between two people, then that's a private agreement. It's not a public. Even though this was like widespread throughout many neighborhoods, many white neighborhoods, they would this would be included in their property agreements. And so this is the Shelley v. Kramer decision is overturning that. Um, okay, and then white flight is coming. It's a term that is popularized around the 50s and 60s, but it's, I think, as he shows, kind of a process that had been taking place for a while before the 50s and 60s. Um, but I think this is where I was also disappointed. But I think it also makes sense that there would be like if as a result of this Shelley v. Kramer decision, they were given like property owners were given a period to like a 5-year period or so to like um, a grace period, we could say, so to like grant so they to like grandfather in, I guess, some property owners to update their and also to, but they were also able to update their contracts to like comply with the new ruling, which is also kind of like undoing. See, this is another example where we have a decision making progress, but it's undermined fundamentally in some way. Um, but I think that the period of white flight from the 1950s to 60s is probably um, contributed to this decision, because now, okay, you can't have you can no longer have these covenant agreements. What about if we're going to make our own separate entities in the suburbs now completely? Like, I don't know how it would coincide, but I have a feeling it might be a contributing factor at least. But obviously, white flight is for going to be for a number of reasons, um, including the fact that the highway systems are being developed in general now. So now people can more easily access, more exterior, more exterior regions of the city. It's a whole discussion, I think, that I would have liked to have had to explored more, but unfortunately, like he didn't really go into it that much. He did go into like some really important things though, about like the how the highways destroyed just communities um, who never got compensation, we could say, for their houses that were destroyed. Um, yeah, we already went to the Milpitas project in California, and we went through all that already. Okay. Okay. In the 1968 Jones v. Mayer, the point is like this is the big loop back from 1883 when housing was um, determined not to be a part of the original Civil Rights Act. Jones v. Mayer is kind of overturning this 1883 decision finally. So after pretty much a century uh, after this decision is finally constitutionally by the Supreme Court rejects it outright. Um, so yeah, this is a if you want to talk with people who think that there was nothing that after like once slavery is over, what's the problem? You can. This is a very easy thing to go into with them with that line of that argumentation that the problems did not end after slavery was abolished, right? Um, okay, and then 1970 is finally when the IRS kind of did their Brown versus Board of Education with the tax exemptions, pretty much. So before this time, you were able to have tax exemptions and be like an openly discriminatory organization. Like you could be a whites only academy and still get your tax exemptions. That shouldn't have been the case. Um, but yeah, anyway, so that's where we're at now, and that's the timeline I have. So I hope you were Hope that was good. That was interesting. Um, and I'll probably, since I'm the only one here today, I'll just end the broadcast there. Yeah, not a whole lot new today compared to last week, but still pretty good. And we all see you guys next week.